Okay, so you see a headline, right? Charges dropped in Eric Adams' case. You think, well, that seems pretty straightforward. Case closed.
Yeah, simple legal update.
But what if I told you that what appears to be a simple legal update is actually peeling back the curtain on something way more complex and honestly, kind of unusual. Welcome to the deep dive, where we take those seemingly simple news stories and, well, we dive deep.
We dive deep.
And today we are focusing on the legal twists and turns surrounding the case against the New York City Mayor Eric Adams.
Right.
For this one, we're looking at an analysis, a pretty compelling one, I think, from the YouTube channel Glenn Kirshner. And they really, take a look at the legal and political weeds of this story. So our mission today is to basically go beyond those headlines that you saw, get past that surface level news, and really grasp what's actually going on here. What's behind this push to dismiss the charges? And then, the big question, what could all of this mean for the integrity of our justice system?
Big one.
Yeah, so, you've probably seen the headlines, but we're going to unpack all this stuff for you, cut through all the noise, and focus on what really matters.
What really matters.
So to kick things off, what really stands out to you about how this whole thing unfolded?
Well, I think what's so fascinating here is just how unusual, right, how unexpected the trajectory of this case has been.
Mm-hmm.
So you have Mayor Eric Adams, and he was initially indicted under the Biden administration.
Right.
And this was for allegations of public corruption.
Right.
Then, well, with the transition to Trump administration, DOJ, they took a very, very different interest in this case.
Right. And it wasn't just we're dropping the charges.
No.
It was this idea of dropping it without prejudice. What does that even mean?
Right. Yeah. So without prejudice, I guess a good way to think about it is almost like hitting pause on a video game, right? You're not deleting the game, you're just pausing it.
Got it. Okay, yeah, so you can always go back, restart it, and you're right back to where you left off.
Exactly.
So essentially, the Trump DOJ, they wanted to drop this case, but with this option to basically revive the charges whenever they wanted. So that means, re-indict him, start that whole process all over again. And the analysis that we looked at suggests, and it makes a pretty strong case, that the motivation here was completely political. They were trying to use these allegations, very serious public corruption allegations, as leverage.
Leverage, yeah.
To get Mayor Adams' cooperation on stuff that Trump wanted, particularly immigration.
Yeah, and that should concern everyone, right?
Yeah.
Because it really raises a fundamental question. Can political agendas actually influence our justice system? I mean, this case is in New York, but this could happen anywhere. And it really doesn't matter what your political leanings are. If you see that this kind of thing is happening, that should worry you. Doesn't exactly make you feel like justice is impartial, does it?
No, not really.
Is justice really blind?
Right. So this idea of holding this threat, this legal threat, over an elected official's head, like the analysis points out, that's really problematic.
Really problematic.
Because it makes you think, well, are their decisions actually based on what's best for the people they represent, their constituents? Or is it because they're trying to avoid being prosecuted again,
Right.
And that brings up another really important point, which is about the independence of elected officials.
Right.
And whether the executive branch, in this case, the DOJ, is overstepping its bounds.
Definitely.
Yeah. And it seems like the judge, in this case, Judge Ho, kind of felt that same way, uneasy about this. So the DOJ requests to just drop this case, no strings attached, without prejudice. They're not getting an immediate yes.
Right.
Judge Ho is like, no, wait a minute.
Yeah.
And then they do something pretty interesting. Judge Ho appoints an outside counsel. It's called an amicus curiae, which basically means it's someone who can offer an impartial legal perspective to the judge.
Yeah, a friend of the court, essentially.
Right, exactly. And their job is to basically present the opposite view. Is it actually appropriate to dismiss the case in this way?
I think what's really significant about Judge Ho taking that step, appointing an amicus curiae, is that it signals that the court really wants to make sure things are done properly. They're not just going to rubber stamp whatever the DOJ wants.
Right.
They want a thorough, independent assessment. And this outside counsel, they really played a critical role in challenging this proposed dismissal and figuring out if there's a better way, a more just resolution.
Now, this is where the whole story, I think, gets really interesting. And it's where a lot of the initial reporting, I think, really missed something crucial. So you had outlets like USA Today, the New York Times reporting that this court-appointed lawyer wanted to just drop the charges completely.
Mm-hmm.
But the analysis we're looking at here, they actually push back on those headlines because they say, well, you're overlooking a really key distinction here.
Huge distinction.
Yeah. It's not about whether the charges should be dropped. It's about how. How do you drop them?
Right. The real issue wasn't whether to dismiss the case, but the terms of the dismissal.
Right.
Like we talked about, the whole without prejudice, with prejudice thing.
The ability to restart the game or completely delete it.
Right.
And that makes all the difference.
Absolutely pivotal.
So this court-appointed lawyer, Paul Clement, he's described as, a prominent conservative Supreme Court advocate.
Big name.
Yeah. And he came down very strongly on the side of dismissing the case permanently.
With prejudice.
With prejudice. So he's advising Judge Ho, listen, this case needs to be dismissed with prejudice, end of story. And here's the thing, his argument, it gets really interesting here. He says that, allowing the DOJ to have this option of basically reviving these charges whenever they want, that creates what he calls the appearance of improper leverage.
Mm-hmm.
And he even goes so far as to call it a potential, quote, actual shakedown.
Yeah, strong words.
It is, right?
Yeah.
So this idea of what's the Greek myth?
Sort of Damocles.
Yes, the sword of Damocles, right. This idea that you've got this sword hanging over your head.
Constantly threatened.
It's a really powerful image.
It is.
So Clement, he lays out all his reasoning in this 33-page legal brief, very detailed. And it really highlights just how important judicial oversight is. Even when the prosecution themselves are saying, we want to dismiss this case, he's saying, hold on, judges have a responsibility to make sure that the terms of this dismissal are fair, that they're just, and that they don't mess with the integrity of the whole system.
Absolutely. And the potential for political coercion in this scenario, that was a big concern for him.
Right. And this whole situation, it really seemed to cause a lot of conflict inside the DOJ itself. The analysis we looked at really highlights this rift. So apparently, Emil B., who at the time was the acting number 2 official, he's the one who tells the Manhattan U.S. Attorney's Office, drop the case, but do it without prejudice.
Yeah, and that directive from such a high-ranking official, it basically triggered what the analysis calls a revolt inside the department.
Wow.
So Danielle Sasson, who was the Manhattan U.S. Attorney at the time, she resigned in protest. And she wasn't the only one.
Really?
Yeah, a bunch of other top prosecutors, both in New York and in D.C., they reportedly left too. So you've got this mass resignation at a really high level, which just shows you how serious those ethical concerns were. It's not every day you see that kind of thing happen.
Yeah, not at all.
Something was clearly wrong.
Yeah, and Sasson, in her resignation letter, she didn't hold back. She straight up alleged that there was a quid pro quo happening.
Oh, wow.
She's saying they dropped the charges in exchange for Mayor Adams cooperating with Trump's agenda. Specifically, that immigration enforcement stuff we talked about earlier, that's a big accusation.
It is, and it really gets to the heart of the concerns raised by the court-appointed counsel, right?
Yeah.
This idea that a criminal prosecution could be used as a bargaining chip, it's deeply troubling.
Yeah.
If that's true, that just erodes public trust in the justice system. It suggests a serious abuse of power.
So you've got Paul Clement, that court-appointed lawyer, and he directly challenged the DOJ's reasoning. He's like, why do you even need to have the option of refiling charges? And he uses that really effective analogy, the sword of Damocles, hanging over Mayor Adams's head. If they can just reactivate those charges whenever, that creates this constant state of vulnerability, right?
Absolutely.
And there's this constant potential for political pressure. So it's a really apt analogy, right?
It is. It perfectly captures that precarious position Mayor Adams would be in if the dismissal were without prejudice. The uncertainty, the threat of those charges coming back, it would definitely influence his decisions, raise questions about his ability to govern independently.
Right, so where could this all go next? Well, the analysis we've been talking about suggests that Judge Ho might hold an evidentiary hearing. What's an evidentiary hearing?
So it's not a trial on those original public corruption charges. It's specifically to examine the motivations behind the DOJ's decision.
Got it.
So they could call people like Emil B. to testify, put them under oath, ask them directly, what was happening? Why did you make this decision?
So trying to get to the bottom of what was going on behind the scenes.
Exactly.
And the argument here is that, the initial prosecution, it seemed pretty solid. So if there weren't any real legal reasons to dismiss the case, well, that kind of points to, Maybe there were some political motivations, so this hearing could shed some light on that.
Absolutely. It's all about transparency and accountability.
And ultimately, it's Judge Ho who has the final say on how this case gets dismissed. But when making that decision, they have to consider, what's in the best interest of the public. And that's a big responsibility.
Huge responsibility.
So now we get to what the analysis called an Easter egg. And it's this really fascinating little detail tucked away in Paul Clement's legal brief. It's a discussion about the judiciary's power when it comes to contempt of court. And this might seem, I don't know, kind of unrelated to the Mayor Adams situation, but it actually has some big implications for how our government works.
Really big.
Like, it's about the separation of powers.
Yeah, it's about checks and balances.
Exactly.
And this is where it gets really interesting. So it's generally accepted that courts, they can't force the DOJ to prosecute a case.
Right.
They can't just appoint a special prosecutor if they feel like it.
Right.
But there's this exception.
There's always an exception.
And it's contempt of court.
Okay.
So the Supreme Court, they've recognized this inherent power of the judiciary to deal with contempt of court.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, contempt of court is basically when someone disobeys a court order. And the Supreme Court says, hey, courts have the power to initiate contempt proceedings. But here's the kicker. They can also appoint a private attorney to prosecute those charges if the DOJ, the executive branch, decides they don't want to.
Wow.
It's a big deal.
It is.
So you can see how this connects to the Mayor Adams case. It's about the judiciary's ability to act independently, especially when the executive branch might not be doing what they're supposed to.
Right. So it's like a safeguard, a check on the executive branch. It's saying, hey, you can't just ignore us. We have our own power here.
Exactly.
So the courts aren't totally reliant on the DOJ.
Right.
So even though it might seem like a side note in this case, this whole discussion about contempt of court, it could be a big deal down the line.
Yeah, it's like a little seed that's been planted.
And if there are more clashes between the executive branch and the judicial branch in the future, well, this power could become really important.
Yeah. It's a reminder that the judiciary, they have their own tools, their own authority. They don't have to rely on the other branches to vindicate themselves.
Okay, so to sum it all up, the Trump DOJ tries to dismiss charges against Mayor Adams without prejudice, which raises some red flags about potential political influence. You've got Paul Clement, the court-appointed lawyer, stepping in saying, no, these charges need to be dismissed permanently to avoid any of that pressure. This creates a whole bunch of internal conflict within the DOJ. Accusations of quid pro quo start flying around. And in the middle of all of this, we get this reminder about the judiciary's power to pursue contempt of court independently.
It's a lot more than what you see in those headlines.
Way more. And it just highlights, how complex our justice system really is. And, the potential for political influence is always there, lurking in the shadows.
It's a reminder to be vigilant, to pay attention, to look beyond the surface.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our final thought for you all. Given what we've discussed today and the potential for future clashes between the executive branch and the judiciary,